Hello and welcome to the Great Telco Debate 2020 and our second topic for this year's event, Cloud. Can hyperscalers and CSPs really play nicely together? Returning for the seventh outing of the annual Great Telco Debate are Chris Lewis and Graham Wild. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Lovely to be back.
Now, in a moment, we'll introduce our industry guests, our expert witnesses who will give their views on the topic, and then we'll present our motion. And it's this motion that we want you to vote on, either for or against. And Chris and Graham will do some last-minute campaigning to support their views. Chris, what's the premise behind today's topic?
Thank you, Guy. The telecom industry has previously really played its own game, made its own rules, and decided what the outcome was going to be. In the advent of the hyperscalers and pressures coming in from the outside, from device manufacturers, from content players and so on, it's increasingly having to play with other parties. And the hyperscalers in particular are beginning to encroach upon the turf of the telcos. So the idea here was to investigate how different players in the industry are working together, different relationships, and the relative roles of telcos and hyperscalers going forward.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, very, very important and interesting topic. Time now to introduce our industry guests who will be providing their expert witness statements. Jehanne Savi, SVP Innovation for Future Connectivity Business at Orange. Johan Christenson, CEO of City Network. Nigel Stephenson, Director of Market Development EMEA, Telco and Edge Cloud with VMware. Kevin Hutchins, SVP Strategy and Corporate Development at Juniper. And Danielle Royston, founder of TelcoDR. Hello everybody, welcome to the Great Telco Debate 2020. Chris, over to you to start things off.
Thank you, Guy, and it's great to be here and to have such a great collection of witnesses to help us with this topic of telcos and hyperscalers playing nicely together. I'm delighted that, Jehanne, you can start us off with a perspective from Orange, so over to you, Jehanne.
Yes, with pleasure indeed. Let's maybe come back to our announcement because it's the most illustrative example of what we consider as being the complementarity and the nice play, as you say, between hyperscalers and telcos. So you see that we announced a partnership with Google in July between Orange and Google, and indeed, it's a strategic move. It's a strategic move for both of us. And it has few objectives. So it has, to be more specific, a double objective. The first one is first to leverage and to enable our telecom operating model transformation. We are going to cloudified networks, let's say, to be simple. With cloud-like architectures, with cloud-like business models. So we have a transformation to achieve, and here we consider that Google is a good partner. It can bring us know-how, and of course we will leverage for that its artificial intelligence tool and leadership. The second significant objective is to serve this this emerging market that we call the edge computing, and that is indeed supported by the belief real time will be a significant value, and we may develop some incremental business about that. And real time, of course, is served both by 5G and is needed over the connectivity. And in the computing stage, and of course, it is where the edge computing comes in the field. So this is a nice complementarity, and indeed a way to position ourselves on this emerging market. It's a strategic move, not only to go for this market, but also to build a significant position of cloud player in Europe. Both of us want to develop this business, generally speaking, starting from today's cloud, today's products and services in the cloud market. So we will also leverage our OBS, which is the branch serving the enterprise in Orange. We will leverage that to position ourselves nowadays in the perspective of the development of future edge computing in the same time frame as the 5G. And this is a European battlefield for us, for both of us, Google and Orange. That's why also we are quite complementary. So to conclude, yes, I think we can play nicely together, and that's the illustration of it with this partnership.
Thank you very much, Jehanne. I think the different roles and different way telcos and hyperscalers play together is certainly something we'll come back to, and I may well question you on that. The reasons for choosing Google later. I'm now delighted, Johan, that you can join us. I've been trying to get you involved with the great telco debate for many years. Please give us your perspective from the City Network's point of view.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. So so City Network, just to give a little bit of background, we're a public cloud provider, which is not super common in Europe, as most of the hyperscalers, of course, are from other continents. So to continue in the background, so in 2005, Europe dominated a lot of the platforms in general. And just 15 years later, I think Europe owns no platform anymore. And pretty much the US and other countries have kind of taken over in a big way. We're all going through the digital transformation, which means it's an innovation journey. It's where we got to come up with digital services, new models, and so forth at a much greater rate. That means that we all need cloud infrastructure or infrastructure as code. But we also need to change our organizations in a big way to be able to utilize this new type of technology as well as the infrastructure as a whole. It means new tools, but above all, it means also a shift in the knowledge that we have. And Europe is going through that. And City Network is one part of allowing that to happen in bigger enterprises. I do not necessarily think that we can play nice together in the sense that I think that the hyperscalers have a huge advantage in the services that are a necessity. And I believe that the telcos, unfortunately, are sitting more on bit pipes. And I think that over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been an ongoing effort to try to innovate within this space from the telco side. But for some reason, I think it comes back to protecting the revenue that one has, which is great revenue, but also which hampers the telcos to innovate and actually compete in some of the areas where the hyperscalers are now totally dominating. And I think that dominance as a whole will make it very, very difficult for telcos to do anything else but to sit nice and try to play along with what the hyperscalers actually want them to do. So I think it'll be interesting times ahead. And I also believe that the regulatory situation is what will make Europe actually come out with some players that can compete at some level with the hyperscalers, not telcos, but startups that need to deliver with European values and European laws as a basic. And I think we're seeing that happening at this point. So looking forward to the debate here.
Thank you, Johan. I knew you'd add an element of controversy into the discussion around the future of the telco in this broader industry. Nigel, can we now come to you and the perspective from VMware?
Sure. And maybe a slightly different, maybe in between perspective from the first two speakers there. So I think if the question is, can hyperscalers and service providers play nicely? I think they can. I think they must. I think to a degree they will. But what I would say is, in order for it to be a long-lasting relationship, then I think the service providers need to think quite carefully about how they manage it. If you look at where we are today, there's a lot of interest now in edge services. A lot of the, if you like, the application side of it is driven by the hyperscalers. So the area of interest is very much focused on what those hyperscalers can deliver for enterprise customers. And in that scenario, the communication service providers are providing an essential component, which is the connectivity. So they're undoubtedly, they have a seat at the table. But the question is connectivity going to be enough? And I think in the longer term, being a connectivity provider for a higher value service is not going to be particularly sustainable, and I suspect it's certainly not going to be especially profitable. So the question then becomes, going forward, how do the communication service providers look at more of the opportunity that things like edge services are delivering? So they look to become more than the connectivity provider, which is not a new issue, but I do think the parameters change a little bit with what's happening at the edge. So today, yes, they are partners, and yes, I think the communication service providers need to look at it as an opportunity to be part of that emerging market, and also to maintain their position in front of their customers, because there are some very significant strategic relationships, and those relationships could get eroded if they don't remain part of the solution. So there's, I think, a mutual benefit to making sure the partnerships work today, and I think that is goodness from both sides. But in essence, it's for the communication service providers to lose, if you like, because I think if they were to withdraw those connectivity services, the hyperscalers would find another way. Yeah, so they are a player, but they need to find a way of adding more value. So there's a couple of things. I think they've got some strengths. I think there's strengths in terms of their locations, their facilities, that could come into play more and more as we look towards edge services and related services. I think they've got strengths in terms of customer relationships. So there are strengths there. And I think as they enter today's relationships for delivering today's edge services with the hyperscalers, they need to be strategizing around how do they do that for today, but also leverage opportunities to grow their significance going forward. And there are opportunities to do that, I think. There is a window of opportunity now as service providers are building out the edge for other applications, for essentially cost-saving applications as well as services. So things like vRAN, things like distributed EPC, these things are driving developments towards the edge of the network for the service providers. They're not necessarily big step changes. So they're things that involve a gradual increase of sites, a gradual movement of services and applications and network functions out towards the edge, maybe the near edge rather than the far edge. But there are things that they can learn from. They are things that they can put in place in a way that provides consistent infrastructure, that provides consistent operations, and could provide them or deliver them into a very good position when it comes to expanding their capabilities more into things like multi-access edge and other potential edge services for their enterprise customers. So there is an opportunity today, I think, to partner and to be part of the solution. But strategically, I think they need to look at what happens next, both in terms of business models, but also in terms of the other things that are happening in their network and their edge rollouts. How do they make sure that they learn from those while there is that window of opportunity as the MEC opportunity grows, as the market grows? How do they leverage what they're having to do anyway for cost savings and general operational needs, so that as the MEC opportunity really starts to develop in probably 3 or 4 years' time, they're in a really good position to start exploiting that and adding their own value, which I think they can do.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And now for another perspective. We like having different perspectives on the topic. I'm delighted to welcome Kevin from Juniper. Kevin, please give us the Juniper perspective, and indeed your own perspective.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to this. I think this is a very interesting discussion topic, and obviously something that's very timely. So at Juniper, we serve many of the largest telcos and service providers in the market, as well as many of the hyperscale cloud providers. And our perspective would be that, over the long term, the hyperscalers and the telcos are going to become increasingly more competitive with each other without a conscious strategy and set of investments really that are designed to preserve some level of a demarcation. So much in the same way that Nigel described a need for a conscious strategy, our view would be the same, that the telcos really do need to have a very conscious strategy here for how do they want to create that demarcation to enable a better together partnership, because otherwise I do believe that you will see really this move in a direction that ultimately will make the two parties much more competitive in the long run. I mean, if you think about it, as applications run in the cloud and the edge, the hyperscalers are really reliant upon the connectivity in the wide area network as critical drivers of their value chain. So, when you think about it in that way, it's in their interest to control, the ease of onboarding and the experience of their customers, really by taking more and more of that solution into their overall portfolio. They haven't really been active in acquiring spectrum up to this point. So, it's clear that the telcos will maintain their control over the last mile. But I think what we'll see with things like 5G, that there's going to be more applications that are going to be running at the edge, IoT content, latency sensitive applications, security enterprise applications, data management for AI. And ultimately, this will become also important to the hyperscalers, as they are the primary developer for most of the cloud native applications. So they'll see that opportunity at the edge as also critical to their value chain. So increasingly, they're going to want to play there. So much like the OTT transformation that happened during the internet era, the cloud providers will increasingly, I think, put more pressure on the telcos to be primarily a provider of connectivity. On the telco side, look, they need to monetize their networks for new applications, because I think, as we all know, pricing for connectivity is going down, not up. And when you think about the 5G transformation, it's really driving the network towards a set of skills that are in the wheelhouse of the cloud providers, right? It's application software running at scale with more automation, more orchestration capability in software. That's really the strength of the cloud providers. So the opportunity here is where the telcos, if they're going to create this demarcation, they have to be thinking more about not just upgrading their network for 5G, but really, how did they control the cloudification of their network? How do they enable, building a platform with 5G that is going to give them a long-term path for controlling not just the connectivity and their distributed network, but that edge environment, which is going to be such a critical key piece. And that includes, not creating an alternative to the cloud providers, but really creating a complement. So an edge that is cloud enabled, that allows for multiple applications, multiple app development environments, that really does bring in then all of the cloud providers as partners, but really allows the telcos to maintain control of what their strength is, which is really that distributed network platform as a service. And so that's why, we're also working on creating alternatives with our service provider customers, including, working with companies like StackPath that really create an alternative edge cloud infrastructure, as opposed to having telcos only have to build it themselves. But we think that that's fundamental, that, it has to be a conscious approach, with investment to really not just upgrade the network, but really build it towards that future of having a cloudified edge. That's going to be the key for creating a better together in the long run.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And a final perspective from our witnesses. I'm delighted, Danielle, you can join us, and with your work that you do in and around the cloud area, please give us your perspective on the two parties playing nicely together.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to participate in the great telco debate. I'm going to start out with a bang and say the public cloud is an unstoppable megatrend that's coming to telco. In 2016, only 6% of enterprise workloads were running in a public cloud. 4 years later, it's up 8x to 48%. And I'm not talking about telco only. I'm talking about all enterprise workloads in the world. And while it's still early in adopting the public cloud in telco, the public cloud is coming. Let's talk about what a mistake it is to try to ignore disruptive technology coming to your business. History is littered with failed companies who question whether or not using disruptive technology was good or bad for them. Examples like Taxi versus Uber or Blockbuster versus Netflix, where the incumbent old way of fighting the disruptive change coming has lost every time. So let's bring it in a little closer to home. Let's take the example of Intel's resistance to the ARM chip back in 2006. In 2006, Intel had the opportunity to invest in the R&D to build the ARM chip for Apple, and they passed on it. Intel felt it would undermine their business and erode their profit margin. They assumed iPhones would not be big and their incumbent x86 tech would win out. They were wrong. The public cloud, just like the ARM technology, is a disruptive change that cannot be ignored. And in this case, it's not the erosion of the telco business per se, but rather the way the incumbent software companies in telco deliver their software. Let's take an example of a software company trying to fight this exact disruption, IBM. How many of you are really excited about their strategy for the last decade regarding the public cloud? Ask yourself, how did IBM allow Amazon to be the leader in the public cloud? How is this working out for them? Not well. Therefore, my position is it's irrelevant to wonder if it's good or bad for telco. And this view that you can hide from it is the way to fail. The way you die is by pretending you can stop the inevitable. So it's not a matter of who needs who, but rather coming to grips with the fact that, like it or not, the public cloud is here to stay. Telcos must embrace it. So make friends with the hyperscalers now. Learn how to use them to your maximum advantage and use them to beat your competitors. Be the firstest with the mostest. Use their massive investment for your business. There are two primary ways to do this. By leveraging their hardware, like using AWS's Graviton 2 trips, which are dramatically cheaper than all your on-premise Intel servers. And by using their software, like their databases, to get rid of your $100 million Oracle spend. With the hyperscalers on your side, figure out all the ways to work with them to help you reduce your costs, improve your revenue, and win in your market.
Thank you, Danielle, and a great perspective there to add to the other witnesses in trying to understand the way in which these two parties come together. One, we talk about the hyperscalers coming from that global perspective, and the telcos then coming from their more national perspectives. So, Jehanne, can I perhaps turn to you from the Orange perspective and your relationship with Google? You said perhaps we should look a bit more into why you chose Google.
The hyperscalers are the leaders, basically. And secondly, we are in a multi-cloud strategy, so we must acknowledge that our customers' demand is about this public cloud. So we serve this demand. So it's quite pragmatic. And then we consider that we have real complementarity, so that it will be a balanced partnership, a win-win partnership, because we have assets, and I think it has been quoted, it's not even our infrastructure, our capillarity, let's say, but it's also our go-to-market, because hyperscalers have only an indirect distribution model. And of course, they come with this notoriety and the ecosystem of developers, of software vendors that will indeed make this new market, these new use cases real, because they need the applications to support them and to run basically this new business. So it's quite funny to see that the use cases we quote for the 5G are the same that the one we quote for the edge computing. Why? Because basically it's all about the real-time promise there. And so here we have also this obvious complementarity and value to defend both of us. We can also add go for adjacent business, let's say, for example, the security, things like that, or the LAN, the end-to-end differentiated quality of service. So I suspect that really it's a good choice to partner with hyperscalers, and specifically why Google. It's both because it's the leader in artificial intelligence, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we have this stake of internal transformation of our operating model as telcos, and so we want to leverage artificial intelligence. Secondly, you know that at the edge computing business, a lot of the use cases will need also artificial intelligence at the edge to support, for example, computer vision-based use cases. And of course, we may also mention that we have, let's say, a common history with Google, with prior partnerships, for example, about submarine cables.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed, Jehanne. As you see, a long-term relationship evolving there with the skills of each side coming together. Johan, from a City Networks point of view and from your point of view, you said in your opening comments, if I might paraphrase, that that the telecoms bit is almost irrelevant to you. How do you go about building the services that you want to deliver to your customers?
Well, I mean, let me make sure that I say it properly, so to speak. I mean, clearly they have a role to play, right? I see the vulnerability of telcos in a world. I think Danielle said it well, like they're being steamrolled, and I think it's a necessity to have the networking. But I think everybody has to be very, very aware of, what's the next piece that's missing that they want to control. And with the deep pockets, of course, one can only imagine how quickly they can make a move. And I frankly think that potentially it's the all the antitrust type of situations that's going on that's actually saving telcos today, because going broader, like the hyperscalers are doing, could potentially put them into trouble as well. So they might just want to make sure that they keep that relationship at an arm's length. Certainly for us, telcos are critical, right? We're a European player, and we're certainly not at the scale that the hyperscalers are. And once you get to like a monopoly or oligopoly type of situation, you have certain powers. And I think from a European perspective, I don't think that there's any company that comes close to that. So we're playing at a different playing field, I would say. At the same time, I'll say that there is a huge momentum, I think, for the rest of the world to create infrastructure services. We cannot necessarily even deliver applications that are legal today in Europe. And I'm not talking just GDPR. I'm talking about a bunch of different laws that we have that are important to us over here that might not be important where hyperscalers live, like in the United States or China, for example. So I think that the trend is going along with the fact that Europe, and I believe also other countries and continents, needs infrastructure players that can deliver similar type of services, but of course then based on the values and the laws of those nations that are delivering them.
Thank you very much, Johan. Very clear, and good to see the initiatives that you've been driving from up there in Sweden, but across the continent, of course. Nigel, from the VMware perspective, you talked about the needs that you see in the way the telcos need to change the way they approach things. Is there evidence in your workings with the telcos that they are beginning to change?
I'd like to see more evidence. I think there is. I think that they're starting to think differently. And actually, just picking up on, I want to pick up on the last comment there, because there are two ways we can look at these partnerships. Both have been illustrated, I think, in this conversation. One is that operators can partner with hyperscalers to deliver a service to a customer. The other is they can partner with hyperscalers to help them develop themselves, or even develop using those platforms and then offer a service to a customer. And I think that change in mindset has to come about, that it's not necessarily about building a service that you can then go sell, but it's about engaging with the customer base and understanding what is needed for a good, win-win business relationship, and then finding a way of delivering that using the strengths that you've got, but also using the ecosystem. And the ecosystem should include the hyperscalers. So, the comments there, about Orange bringing in AI expertise from Google is a good case in point, to be able to leverage that both for your own network infrastructure and your operational piece, but also potentially to develop solutions that have a much closer fit to your key customer requirements. And I think once you start to develop solutions very targeted at a strategic customer in terms of solving their business need as a business partner rather than a service provider, which I think are slightly different, then I think you can say, okay, once we've done that, does that take us into an industry specialism? Do we go and try and replicate that in other industries? Or do we take the learnings from that and see if we can apply it differently and create other types of value for other types of customers? And in that sense, I think we are seeing examples of service providers starting to behave differently. I'm seeing references, I know customers like Vodafone, for example, will putting much more focus on saying, look, we have a key set of customers. Let's understand in much more detail what they need for their business, and then let's work out how we can solve for that. And if you take that approach to building a business rather than developing a service, then I think you start to change the needle somewhat. And in that context, bringing in an entire ecosystem, including the hyperscalers, is part of the solution. And what I'd like to see going forward is, as we build, and certainly in the work that VMware is doing, looking at what we need to do from a technology perspective to support things like edge services and near edge, far edge, vRAN, whatever it may be, there are technology implications there. But a big piece of that is the operational piece. And a big piece of that is opening up infrastructure, not only to the operations teams within service providers and within customers, within enterprise customers, the IT department, but also opening it up to the developers. And that's a big part of our strategy right now, is to make sure that whatever we do starts to help the developer community become part of the solution as well, in a way that they haven't been before. So I see the proliferation of edge services as supporting that bringing in of the developer community, where the developer community could be your enterprise customer, it could be a third party, it could be a startup, it could be somebody working off a hyperscaler, but building that developer mentality, both including an ecosystem of developers, but also looking to develop yourself, I think is quite key. And yes, I mean, to answer your question, I think we are seeing those kind of changes starting to come about within the CSP community.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And Kevin, I guess a similar question to you, since I think you didn't use the term straddle, but you straddle both markets. Are you seeing similar demands being asked of you from the telco community and the hyperscalers, or is it very different? And do you see evidence of it settling down into perhaps more specialized roles for either side?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that they both have similar objectives, and I think, to Nigel's point, the edge is really an important part of this, because that's the place where I think you're going to see the two sides come together and clearly need to make a decision on how they're going to play. I mean, if you think about it today, the hyperscalers' strengths are really in scale, right? They're exceptionally good at large scale automation, large scale data center operations, being able to run the infrastructure with very low cost and a lot of agility. At the moment, that doesn't really lend itself well to extending to the edge, which is the domain of the service providers, and the ability to run a fairly large distributed system and deal with all of the location-driven dynamics like permitting and managing multiple different sites that are not going to be as large as the large central data centers that are usually housed in places that are not really that difficult to manage from a geographic perspective. So you think about, there is some friction right now for the hyperscalers to move into that space. But again, they, as was pointed out, I think in multiple comments, with their resources and with the opening up of the market and with a need for them to, be able to control more of their own destiny, they will eventually go there if they feel they need to. I mean, that's clearly been the dynamic in the hyperscale space over the last 10 years. On the service provider side, I mean, they actually were moving down this path. I mean, they virtualized many of their core services here over the last several years. But I think what I think has emerged from that, we were involved in a lot of those types of projects with many of the tier one hyperscalers. I think what's emerged out of that, though, is that in that process, the service providers really were not able to build platforms for innovation. Instead, what they got into were largely moving from purpose-built appliances into more purpose-built really software stacks that because of all of the desire to maintain standards and multi-vendor integration and the ability to largely drive a lot of procurement leverage, they sort of ended up in a situation where those clouds were really not built to enable innovation. They were built more to solve specific needs with virtual services. And if the service providers kind of repeat that as they go towards where Nigel's describing, right, the whole mobile edge computing, virtualization of the RAN, really the extension of the edge into the access domain, then I think they'll give away probably their single biggest opportunity here, which I think also will give them the biggest area to create a strong partnership with the hyperscalers, and that's that they would have a platform for really enabling their network as an innovation engine, and be able to, I think Jan mentioned earlier this notion of the having multiple different developers and application development environments, and really being cloud neutral, right? So if someone wants to develop in Azure for IoT, or if someone wants to develop an Anthos for AI, having the ability to support both of those ecosystems on the edge would be a real advantage for the service providers. And there's opportunity, right? It's the part of the network that they actually own today. They're strong in managing in those localized environments, large distributed systems. But they do need to evolve, right? I mean, they need to evolve how they think about their OSS, BSS. They need to think about how they evolve to develop this edge compute such that it doesn't kind of turn into a procurement-driven exercise, but really turns into more of a platform for innovation. And then they need to be intentional about supporting multiple different clouds within that. Because they will create, then eventually dependency on individual cloud providers. And I think that will ultimately lead to a situation where the cloud will extract most of the value in that opportunity. So I think it's not dire, but it's now is the time. The 5G transformation, I think, is the time for the service providers to really get intentional about how they want to drive this transformation of their network, with the future in mind. Otherwise, they'll be disrupted.
Thank you, Krevin. That's a great perspective. Now, Danielle, this sort of plays completely into your hands, and you talked about the cloud is coming. Do you want to put a bit more color on that in terms of, I think we've agreed the telcos have had this sort of inward, slightly national perspective, because that's the way their businesses grew up, and innovation was on their terms. What would you recommend to them in terms of the way that cloud can help them with their innovation, and any lessons learned from the cloud people that you interact with regularly?
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole idea of friend or foe of the hyperscalers, we should just take a step back, because absolutely, if they want to disrupt telco, they have the size, they have the scale, they have the funding, they can acquire the talent because they're brand names that everyone would love to put on their CV or resume, and so they absolutely could come over here and stomp all over telco very easily. I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, would they do that? Would they go do that? We're talking about a retailer that then moved into essentially software, right? An ad company in Google, search company, software company, and then Microsoft, it's a software company. And so I think the first thing you need to ask yourself is this a natural extension of their business model and what they do? And then I think the second question you ask yourself is, can it scale massively with little or neutral cost? And can they do those two things easily? And I think the answer is no. I think, yes, they could come into telco. I think, would they? No. I mean, they see the struggle that telcos have in monetizing their network. Building a bunch of tiny little clouds all over a country is not something these guys are into. These guys are into massive scale. They're into the software. And so to block them out and not use that as an advantage in your business would be a huge miss for a telco, right? I mean, just think about if your competitor embraced the public cloud in a major way and embraced all the software and all those benefits. And so great examples of that are like when I was CEO of Optiva, which is a BSS OSS, real-time charging company. I proved that the charger could run in the public cloud and save 80% of total cost of ownership. You look at Vodafone, who's doing a really great project with Google Cloud, where they've decided to completely move their entire on-premise analytics up into the public cloud. They're planning to remove, I think, something like 800 Hadoop servers across 11 countries, 26 opcos running 220 plus revenue models. And so what used to take, hours and days to run in terms of those analytic jobs, now they'll take, minutes. And so having that real-time insight to their customer can drive a really awesome experience for their subscribers. What's so great about this technology is that previously this technology was expensive, it was difficult to install. But now with the public cloud, you're paying, as you use it, as much as as little as you need. You don't have to buy this big, huge upfront cost. And so tier 2s and tier 3 providers can now have access to this world-class software at an affordable price and really drive an improved experience for their subscribers. And so, the universally shared experience is how hard it is to do business with your telco. It's probably the most neglected area. It is the piece that the telcos own, right? The telcos own the subscriber relationship and they neglect it the most. And so my idea here is leverage all this great software. We complain all the time about those guys going over the top on our pipes. This is your opportunity to go over the top on their, $500 billion investment in data centers and use that to your advantage. And so that's my perspective on leveraging the software from the public cloud vendors.
Thank you, Danielle. And I think everyone would agree the sort of views we've had there, both in the statements and in the Q&A there, gives us this idea that actually it's not one versus the other. It's about which party brings which specialization of service to the market, who's dealing with the customers, and ultimately how, in the long term, we construct the telecom industry to best serve the customers, but also to work as closely as possible with all those hyperscalers, all those cloud players, with their expertise as well. Guy, with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and a big thank you to all of our experts. Great range of perspectives and views there, which is exactly what our audience needs for the great telco debate. Right, you've been presented with the facts, and now we want you to participate. You may have your own questions for our witnesses. Well, if you do, send them in and we'll add them to the mix for our live show, which is on Thursday, December the 10th at 4 p.m. UK time. Now, get ready to vote because here comes our motion.
And the motion is, telcos need to move quickly to stop the hyperscalers from encroaching on their turf.
So there we have it. Telcos need to move quickly to stop the hyperscalers from encroaching on their turf. Chris and Graham have tossed the great telco debate coin to see who's going to speak for this motion and who's going to speak against the motion. Graham, I see that you won and you'll be speaking first and presenting your views for the motion.
I will. So, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote for the motion. Telcos do need to move quickly to stop hyperscalers encroaching on their turf. And let me give you some evidence for that, right? So there's a couple of really interesting things which are going on in the industry right now. The technology at the core of telco networks is becoming much more software-based, much more cloud-based. And that's exactly the territory that the hyperscalers play in. And I don't think it's any accident, for example, that Microsoft recently bought Affirmed, a provider of core network technology, built from the ground up as software, which we can run on any server. The other thing I think that's really interesting is that in some areas, and I would say that in private networks, 5G private networks, for example, would be one of those areas. Some of the vendors, and they're not hyperscalers themselves, people like Nokia, for example, are building direct relationships and providing services directly to the end customer. So I don't think it takes a genius to add those two things together and say that on the one hand, we've got technology at the core of networks, which the hyperscalers are very comfortable with and want to acquire. And on the other hand, it's possible for those technology providers to have direct relationships with end customers. And that really leaves the telcos with very little, just some fiber and some spectrum. So I urge you, ladies and gentlemen, to vote for the motion.
Thank you, Graham, voting for the motion. So now it's Chris's turn to present his views as to why you should vote against the motion.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you, Graham. This is such a critical question, the relative relationship between telco providers and hyperscalers. And it sort of occurs to me that thinking about the COVID situation, we've had very much the hyperscalers are playing on a global level. The telcos emphasizes the fact that they are playing on a local level, indeed, if not even on a hyper-local level. So the way in which telcos respond to what the hyperscalers are doing, in my mind, it's against the interest of all parties to be going after what the hyperscalers are doing. They cannot gain that scale. They cannot possibly work on that sort of level. The way in which telcos need to extend the reach, whether it be into rural communities, whether it be to extend to connect all of those IoT devices, all of those millions and billions of devices and the people that we want to be connected for the future, that's where we should be emphasizing the future of the telecom industry. So in many ways, perhaps the game is already lost in terms of that edge and the way in which these two parties interact. So I encourage you to vote against the motion because I think in many ways that game is already lost, but we do need the emphasis on building that underlying infrastructure to make sure that we all remain connected, whatever the circumstances.
Thanks, Chris. We have our motion and we have our arguments for and against, two very compelling arguments. But the important thing is, what do you, our audience, think? Are you for or against? Have your views been influenced by any of our experts, or have Chris and Graham's last minute pleas changed your mind? Well, vote now. There are green and red buttons below this video, for and against. Just click the one that matches your choice. And next to that is an area for you to submit your questions for our live show as we continue the debate and then reveal the final motion results. Thank you again to all our guests for taking part today. Very much appreciated. Don't forget, there will be 6 debates and 6 corresponding motions. Catch them all and then come and join us for our live end of year Great Telco debate. Goodbye for now.